Hey, Kyle. I got your voicemail earlier today. I'm sorry I wasn't able to call you back at the time. I hate doing this by email, but maybe it's better this way. It's easier to get my thoughts out like this than in person. It feels easier to write it all down than to have to say it over the phone. Ask me to explain this on the spot, and I don't think I could ever find the words. Hell, I'm not sure that the right words even exist. I understand if you're upset by my resignation. I know I told you that this job was everything I wanted, and I wasn't lying when I said that. But I need you to understand now that I cannot go back into the woods. I won't. You asked about what happened to me the other day, and I feel as if I owe you an explanation. But it's harder to articulate than you could imagine. It's not so much what I saw out there. It's what I've been seeing. It's what I know now is out there. It's not an easy thing to just explain, so I'll start at the beginning. You remember back in late June, early July? You sent me out towards Port Rowan to catch some pictures of the wildlife and the wetlands. Honestly, I was happy to get the call. I've always liked that area, and I'd like to think I know it pretty well. I meant it when I said I didn't mind spending a few days out there. I don't think enough people really appreciate the beauty of the wetlands in Lake Erie's coastal basin, but I do. I've been out in that area enough to know where to set up to get some decent shots. There are some decent paths consistently used by wildlife out there, and they haven't changed much over the years. I followed one of them down into this really gorgeous area of marsh that's good for catching photos of smaller wildlife such as frogs, bugs, turtles, and even some snakes. Every now and then, you'll even see some deer in the area. I set up a spot nearby where I could sit undisturbed and take my pictures. On the first day out, I got lucky, and I saw a small group of deer out near the edge of the water around sunset. I remember that they'd passed in front of a dead-looking tree with twisted bark and a massive burl that budged out of its midsection. Do you remember those shots? I think I sent them to you either that evening or the evening after. You should be able to see the tree I was talking about in the background. Normally, I wouldn't bother bringing up the tree at all, since normally it wouldn't exactly be noteworthy. I've seen burls like that before. They're interesting, but nothing special. Sure, this one was one of the bigger ones I've seen, but even that isn't all that special. I can't say I paid all that much mind to it, until a few days later, when I came back to that spot. I'd set up some of my trail cameras in the area while I'd been out there on the first day, so I'd come back to pick them up. I was admittedly kinda hoping I could get some good sunrise shots as well, although I remember that the marsh seemed a lot quieter than it had before. I noticed it when I was heading down to collect the cameras. Not gonna lie, I was kinda disappointed. Like I said, I really like that area, and I was a little surprised to hear absolutely nothing except my own footsteps as I went back out there. No birds, no animals. Come to think of it, I don't even think I heard any crickets buzzing. There's a really distinct line between the comforting silence of the forest and just absolute dead silence, and I remember thinking that something was wrong, although I honestly couldn't take a guess as to what. Once I had all my cameras, I ventured back out into the same part of the marsh that I'd been in the other day, hoping I'd find something, but I just found more uncomfortable silence. Writing this down, I remember now that I didn't hear a single other sound beside the plop of my own boots in the mud. I'd found a vantage point to wait around for a bit, and was hoping that whatever had scared everything off would pass, but I must have been out there for about 45 minutes before I gave up. It was while I was out in the marsh that I noticed that tree again. Maybe if everything was normal, I wouldn't have paid it any mind, but since there was nothing else around, it really just seemed like the only thing I could really focus on. Looking back at it, I wish I'd thought to take some pictures of that tree, but the idea honestly just never crossed my mind. It was splintered, as in mostly just a pile of broken splinters. You ever seen what happens to some trees when they're struck by lightning? The force of it just kind of blows them apart. The tree looked like that. I recognized some of the twisted bark on the sagging branches that were still intact, but most of the trunk was just straight up gone. So was that massive burl. Now, considering how I compared that tree to the one that had been struck by lightning, the answer as to what happened seemed pretty obvious. If it looks like it got struck by lightning, and it's been a particularly rainy summer with a lot of thunderstorms, well, on paper that sounds like some simple math. But I'd been in the area over the past few days. We didn't have any thunderstorms. Hell, we didn't even have any rain so far that week. Look, I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about it at the time. I just mentally noted it as something weird before moving on with my day. I think I just dismissed it as lightning. Once I realized that there was nothing to photograph in the area, I went back to my motel to take a look at the footage from my trail cams. You've probably seen the highlights of that footage. There wasn't a lot there, but I did catch some really good clips of a small group of deer heading up from the marsh. Then there were a few clips where the camera was either set off by birds or squirrels. None of those were really usable, so I just deleted them. Honestly, most of the footage that I got was pretty standard, with the exception of some of the last clips from camera 4. See, camera 4 was the one closest to the marsh. I'd set it up about 15 meters from where I'd been taking my photographs, and I watched the entrance to the deer trail. Most of the footage I got from it wasn't any different from what I got on the other cameras. There were those deer I mentioned, some birds, squirrels, and one dragonfly who tripped the motion sensor. But near the end of the clips, there was one that was, well, it was really weird. The footage was time-stamped around 3 a.m., the morning that I'd gone and picked up the cameras. This was about 8 or so hours before I'd actually picked up the camera. At first, it just looked like something small had tripped the motion sensor, although I couldn't get a good look at what. I rolled the footage back a couple of times, looking for a squirrel or a bird or something. It took me a while before I actually noticed that there was something moving through the trees in the background. I've watched that footage more times than I can count, and I still can't get a good look at what exactly it is. But I know what it isn't. It isn't a deer, it isn't a squirrel, it isn't a bird, and it isn't a bug. Whatever it is, it blends in really well with the trees surrounding it. Well enough that it's hard to get a good guess as to what the shape of it is from my best guess. It was standing at around 9 or 10 feet tall. I think it was walking upright, although it also seems to lurch downwards near the end of the footage and start crawling. In the footage, I can see it coming from the right side of the camera frame, crossing behind the trees, a good 15 feet away from the camera, and ducking down to crawl before it slips out of frame. I've attached the footage to this email. I don't know what I expect you to do with it. I think it might be best if I don't share it. I don't think it definitely proves anything. I'm sure people will claim to see all kinds of mundane things out there, and that's just gonna muddy the waters. But I've been doing this for a long time, Kyle. I know the animals that live in this area, and that was not one of them. I still don't know what that thing was, not for sure anyway. Maybe that's for the best. I never really made any connection between the splintered burl and the thing I saw on my trail cameras until a couple of weeks later. I've got a friend who does some hunting up north named Roger. I don't see him all that often when he's in town. I'll usually go out of my way to grab a beer with him and shoot the shit. Our conversation almost inevitably turned to our time out in the woods, since we both shoot animals in our own ways, and I'd mentioned having seen something odd on one of my trail cams. Well, as soon as I'd mentioned it, Roger just had to see it for himself. I was still sober enough to drive, so he went back to my place, and I dug up the footage on my laptop. The first time I played it, Roger just sat there intently, keeping a close eye on it. Then, when I pointed out the thing moving in the background, he asked me to wind it back a bit. I did what he asked, and we watched that specific clip a few more times. Roger's eyes followed that thing very carefully, and I could see him squinting, trying to figure out just what the hell it was. He never seemed to come up with an answer that satisfied him, though. Eventually, he asked me to roll it back a bit further, and I did. He asked if these videos had sound. I told him that they did, and I turned it up so he could hear it better. And that's when I heard it. About 15 minutes prior to that sighting of whatever it was that had appeared on the camera, there was a sound. Even with the volume all the way up, it was faint, but I felt sure that I recognized it. It was the sound of something falling. A tree. I could hear the distant crack as wood was stretched and broken. I could hear the rustle of leaves as they fell. Something, somewhere in that area, had taken down a tree, and my mind immediately turned to that tree with a swollen burn that had been torn apart that day. Roger remained silent as he listened to the sounds of the tree being destroyed, a strange look on his face. His eyes were narrowed in thought, and I waited for him to speak. At last, he asked me if I'd noticed anything funny in that area when I'd collected the trail camera. Naturally, I told him about the tree that I'd seen, and when I did, he got a really strange look on his face. It was then that he told me his own story, about finding a splintered tree in the woods. I'll relay it here as best I can. Roger had been out hunting about a year or so back. He'd gone out with a couple of friends of his, just like they had 1,000 times before, so it really shouldn't have been any different. Only I guess this time it was. They had a cabin out in the woods where they'd slept and taken care of their kills, and there was this tree not too far from it. They passed it on their usual trail into the woods. Now, this tree had its own massive burl that was almost as big as he was, and he said he'd considered taking an axe to it just to see how much he could get for it. A good burl can fetch a lot of money, although he also said that he'd never considered it that seriously. Anyways, he and his buddy had gone out for the day and spent most of that day in the woods. On the way in, they'd passed the tree with the burl and hadn't thought a thing of it. They'd had a fairly ordinary day out, and his buddy had shot a 10-point buck. They were headed back when he said he heard a sound through the woods, the sound of splitting wood, followed by a falling tree. Now, Roger and his buddy hadn't known what the hell was going on. They weren't sure if someone had cut something down, or maybe some old, damaged tree had finally given out. Either way, the impact really didn't affect them where they were, so they just continued on back to their cabin. Then, when they were headed up the trail back home, they saw it. Broken wood all over the trail, and the tree that had used to have that massive burl tipped over. He said that the way it had fallen, it had just barely missed the roof of their cabin. Neither of them could really figure out just what the hell had happened. According to Roger, it was a perfectly sunny day. Not a cloud in the sky, so there was no way in hell it could have been lightning. According to him, it seemed as if that tree had just blown up. All that was left of the burl was some splintered wood, and he could have swore that he saw a new path leading into the woods, as if something big had ventured off in that direction. Although he never explicitly said he ever saw anything out there. He and his buddy had ultimately just shrugged their shoulders and carried on. They were back home again the next day, and neither of them could figure out just what had happened to that tree. I can't imagine that either of them cared that much either. Well, until Roger heard that same sound of splintering wood in my footage. We spent a good chunk of that night looking over that footage I'd captured, but the best guess we had was that it might have been a distant bear. I don't think either of us believed that, though. Whatever it was too big to be a bear. But we didn't have a better answer. Eventually, I let Roger have my couch and drove him to the house he was staying in the next morning. We didn't talk about the things we'd seen in the woods. Despite all of this, I really wasn't against going back to marshlands around Lake Erie when he brought it up. When you asked if I could go back, I meant it when I said I'd be happy to. I knew I'd seen something weird out that way, but it wasn't like I had any real reason to be bothered by it. Honestly, I figured that the mystery beast Roger and I hadn't been able to identify was probably just a fluke, and I didn't think too much about the splintered trees. There were probably 1,000 rational explanations as to what caused those pressurized moisture in the burls, causing them to pop, maybe. I don't know. I suppose it held as much water as any other theory I had. I didn't go out to the same spot I'd gone to last time. It'd been awfully dead before. I figured I might have better luck elsewhere. I tried a few different places over my first day there. Didn't stay long in most of them. Some of them I'd been to before. Anything of note you should already know about. I sent you the pictures. I set up some trail cameras too, along some promising looking spots I found. Most of them ultimately turned up some interesting finds, but one, camera 6, I'd run across another tree with a burl while I'd been following a deer trail I'd found, looking for a good place for the camera. It wasn't the best spot, but the burl reminded me of the one I'd seen a few months back. It was swollen like a tumor and had almost completely swallowed up that entire tree trunk. Some part of me wanted to move on, find a better spot, and let whatever this was lingering in the back of my mind go. The rest of me wasn't so sure, and I figured, well, what the hell did I have to lose by indulging myself a little? Yeah, I know it was a long shot. I know it might not have been the brightest idea, but it made sense at the time to set the camera up there. I figured that in a worst-case scenario, I'd have some unusable footage and I'd need to rely on my other cameras to get something good. In a best-case scenario, maybe I'd finally find out what was going on with those burls. I honestly wasn't expecting much. In my best-case scenario, I'd probably have some video evidence of a lightning strike or some weird but otherwise perfectly mundane natural phenomenon where a tree just explodes for some damn reason. More than likely, I doubted I'd actually see anything at all, other than a tree with a pretty big burl in it. Nothing all that special. Honestly, I wish that's all that it was. I truly do. I came back about 2 weeks later to pick up the trail cameras. The other cameras were fine. You got the highlights from those. But I never sent you anything from camera 6. When I returned to the spot where I'd set up camera 6, I was greeted by the sight of splintered wood and a collapsed tree, just about the same thing I'd seen in that marsh a couple months back. I remember staring at it in complete awe. I honestly hadn't expected to catch anything, but, well, there it was. The splintered tree told me that whatever it was I'd been wondering about was right there, on that tape. I couldn't have got it back to the car fast enough. I actually waited to collect my other cameras just to get to a place where I could set up my laptop and watch the footage back. I stopped off at the nearest place I could find, plugged the SD card in, put on my headphones, and started speeding through that footage. I don't think there's a single thing on God's green earth that could prepare me for what I saw. I've debated whether or not to send you the video. I don't know if anyone else should see what I've seen. I don't know if other people should know what I know. Because if they did, then like me, they won't ever be able to set foot in the forest again. If they knew what came out of that damn tree, they'd be as afraid as I am. I know that if you saw it, you'd probably hand in your resignation too. I tell myself that if we've gone this long without disturbing whatever it is that's out there, then maybe we can do it forever. Maybe what I found was a fluke. I got lucky to run into this, not only once, but twice. After all, I've never heard anyone else describe anything like this. Not in legends or anything else. Maybe it's better that people don't know about them, because then they're more likely to leave them alone. They won't be looking for them and risk angering whatever's out there. I don't know if that's a noble mindset or a crazy one. Shit. I don't know much about anything anymore. All I know is what I saw on that video was the birth of something greater than us. I know that the ungodly skeletal thing that tore its way out of that tree, snarling and hissing, is not something that we can fight against. I knew it as I watched it free itself, ripping through the bark of the tree and splintering it with its raw strength. I watched it tumble onto the ground, exposed bones made of something that looked like twisted and gnarled wood, although it must have been something much more durable. I watched it pick itself up and look around, trying to make sense of the world it had found itself in, before on all fours, it just crawled off, going into the forest, leaving only its distorted wails, quickly fading into the distance before a heavy silence set in, as if every animal in the woods knew to avoid that area, and just what had been born into it. What I saw on that footage, Kyle, it looked a lot like a human baby, or at least the bones of a baby. But whatever it was new. It had just been born into this world. Whatever it was just a baby. And I can't stop wondering what it'll become when it's all grown up.